before we continue with our second webinar in focus on democracy in Latin America on this particular occasion, on government responses to emergencies, and with the great pleasure of having guest speakers all the way from Buenos Aires, Juan Santiago Ylarri, and from Bogotá, from the Universidad Nacional de Colombia, Alejandro Mantilla, and here with us at the University of Victoria, Marta Kleiman. I want to start first and foremost by acknowledging the territory in which our university stands. So it is with respect that we acknowledge the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanix people whose historical relationship with the land continue to this day. And as we are here united to discuss issues that pertain to Latin America, I also wish to respectfully extend this territorial acknowledgement to all the pueblos originarios of the Americas. So I wish to thank in particular the collaboration of the Center for Global Studies, which is what has allowed us to come together and continue with this discussion. In particular at the center, Stephanie Grilke and Jody Walsh have been very kind in their support. But I also want to recognize that this is an initiative that started and continues to be sustained by Fabricio Teló from the Universidad Rural do Rio de Janeiro, and Marta Kleiman herself, who is today as a participant. I really do want to recognize and thank you two young scholars for your initiative in continuing with this discussion. And Marta, at the end, you might want to announce our third webinar that you and Fabricio are already organizing. So I'll let you do that towards the end. So the way this event will unfold is I'm going to ask my colleague Michelle Bonner from the Department of Political Science, who has kindly agreed to moderate the event and introduce our speakers. So without further ado, it's on to you now, Michelle. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So I will be moderating today's session. It's a pleasure to be chairing this session. It's going to be an interesting topic, not only just generally about emergencies, but given the context of the pandemic, I think we're all experiencing emergencies of different sorts. So I'm sure there'll be many insights from the talks that we have today. I am going to briefly introduce each of the speakers and the order that they will take. I ask that each speaker take 15 to 20 minutes. I will keep time so that we have an opportunity for question and answers at the end. So hopefully pay attention to me, speakers. Can you see that? Does that look all right? Or is it backwards? It's backwards. You get the idea. It's meant to be a 2. It means you have 2 minutes. This one works a little bit better. 0 means you have no more time left. That at least works the other way around. So I will put that up, so just pay attention to me as we go along. All right, so we have our first speaker. I'm going to introduce all 3, and then I'll let them go in sequence. So our first speaker will be Juan Santiago Ylarri, who is an attorney at law and PhD in law at the from the University of Buenos Aires. He has a master's degree in constitutional law from the Center for Political and Constitutional Studies in Spain, a specialist degree in economic administrative law from the Catholic University of Argentina. He's a professor of constitutional law and administrative law at the University of Buenos Aires, University of Business and Social Sciences, and the National University of La Matanza. He's a researcher at the Institute for Legal and Social Research, Ambrosio L. Gioja, at the University of Buenos Aires. He's a law clerk at the Federal Court of Appeals on Administrative Litigation Matters, Panel 3, Argentina, and he has written 2 books and published more than 50 papers in different legal journals in Argentina, Spain, and many other countries in Latin America. Marta Kleiman is our second speaker. She's a PhD student in the Department of Political Science here at the University of Victoria. She is currently working on her dissertation that focuses on emergency legislations in Canada and Argentina. She completed her master's in European Studies and a second master's in Human Rights and Transitional Justice at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And our final speaker will be Alejandro Matia. He is a philosopher, a member of the editorial board of La Siniestra magazine, and a professor at the National University in Colombia. So welcome, and thank you so much for being here with us today. So I'll hand things over first to Juan Santiago Ylarri.
Okay, thank you very much, Michelle. I would like to thank the Latin America Research Group of the Center for Global Studies of the University of Victoria for the invitation to participate in this meeting. It's an honor to share this panel with Alejandro Mantilla, Marta Kleiman, and also with Michelle Bonner and Beatriz de Alba Koch. I will refer to the emergency powers in Argentina. First, I will focus on the constitutional regulations of emergency powers. Then I will analyze two emergency rules incorporated in the constitutional reform of 1994, and I will allude especially to its relations with the economic emergency. Also, I will make references to the COVID-19 crisis and the scope of judicial review on the matter. Finally, I will offer some concluding remarks. All of this in 20 minutes, I promise. Constitutional law draws a dividing line between normal and exceptional situations. Constitution establishes a set of mechanisms regulating certain situations considered normal and foreseeable. But there are certain extraordinary situations for which standard constitutional resources may not be sufficient. As a response to such a crisis, many constitutions incorporate an alternative way of organizing power, which entails the provisional denial of the original constitutional order. The Argentine constitution has not been a stranger to this issue, so exceptional mechanisms have been included to handle exceptional situations. While the gamut of emergencies is extremely varied, three categories may be identified: war, domestic disorder, and economic crisis. Up until the constitutional reform of 1994, the Argentine constitution had regulated only one exceptional mechanism, the state of siege. Section 23 establishes this mechanism in the event of war, actually foreign attack, and domestic disorder. Besides, Section 29 establishes that Congress may not vest on the national executive power, extraordinary powers, or the total public authority. After the 1994 constitutional amendment, two additional types of exceptional mechanisms were included: legislative delegation and decrees of necessity and urgency, both of which include economic emergency. Also, it is important to highlight that Section 7522 stated that many human rights treaties have constitutional hierarchy, including the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights and the American Convention on Human Rights. Both treaties establishes the suspension of guarantees under extreme circumstances. With respect to the state of siege, Section 23 regulates these states of exception and defines the conditions that need to be met in order to declare it. I quote, "In the event of domestic disorder or foreign attack endangering the full enforcement of this constitution and the authorities hereby established, the province or territory which is in a turmoil shall be declared in a state of siege, and the constitutional guarantees shall be suspended therein." End of quote. The articles stated also that during such a suspension, the President of the Republic shall not pronounce judgment or apply penalties on his own. In such case, his power shall be limited with respect to persons, to their arrest or transfer from one place to another of the nation to another, should they not prefer to leave the Argentine territory. In addition to physical liberty, the Supreme Court in different rulings held that freedom of the press and the right to make political assembly, among others, could also be restricted during an emergency. I want to stop to analyze deeply this state of emergency. I will just say that from 1854 until 2001, the last time which was used, the state of siege was declared 57 times. The scholars agree that there has been an abuse of this institute, and there were not a proper judicial review on this issue. Nino has said that the state of siege has simply been the cemetery of our freedoms. Unlike the state of siege, Economic emergency had no place in the formal constitution first, but it was part of the customary constitutional law, which produced a series of rules, mainly court-made in nature, on the conditions and limits of the emergency rules. Authors have established a similarity between the state of siege and economic emergency, because just like the political state of siege strongly limits rights with personal content, an economic emergency entails an economic state of siege, given that the rules declare an economic emergency strongly restrict rights with economic content. The concept of economic emergency in the economic and social arena has been connected with the concept of police power, which was born in the US law. While the Argentine constitution has no specific provisions regarding the police power, it must also be noted that there are constitutional provisions which are the regulatory basis for the police power, such as sections 14 and 28, which mention the restrictions of rights and guarantees. Argentina has experienced the same changes in courts' opinions as those that have taken place in the United States. Until 1922, Argentinian courts endorsed a libertarian Lochner-type approach. After the Depression in the 1930s, forced the adoption of emergency measures. The Supreme Court clearly had referred to broad police power. In Russo case, the court clarified that it had abandoned the restrictive doctrine adopted in previous decisions, and it had come to embrace a broad and full notion of police power, one of whose elements is emergency. The court established that in an emergency situation, the regulatory power of the Congress is broader and deeper and entails government being more involved in regulating rights. The court said that in those cases, government power is intensified and that mechanisms or procedures which would otherwise not be valid are actually valid. Some authors have highlighted that the doctrine of emergency ceased to be justified in the exercise of police power. They went on to say the matter should be analyzed in light of the state of necessity, considering that the Supreme Court started to make express references to the fact that the economic emergency rules were necessary to ensure the continuity and survival of national union. Sagüez has made a very accurate analysis of this issue, clearly stating that the emergency law is a chapter of the necessity law, although subject to different requirements. Another matter that needs to be considered in connection with the evolution of economic emergency doctrine in Argentina is that in the Ercolano case in 1922, which recognized emergency police power, and its more in-depth discussion in Avico in 1934, emergency cases usually had to do with economic and social emergency, or cases in which the society was affected, but the matter did not extend to the government itself. For instance, the Supreme Court validated rules that established maximum prices for urban leases and extensions of lease contracts, or rules that impose upon mortgages, moratorium on payments and cap interest rates, a stay of evictions, maximum prices for basic necessities, or allowed a law requiring cinema owners to include live performances. After the line of court decisions, the Peralta case may be considered square one. Emergency police powers was also extended to the emergency affecting the government itself, especially considering public deficits. Thus, the Supreme Court validated an emergency rule that altered payments on deposit certificates. Time deposits were converted into public bonds in order to reduce public debt, admitted the consolidation of Argentine debt, the reduction in public employee salaries, the staying of the enforcement of court judgments ordering the payment of a sum of money entered against the Argentine government, among others. On the other hand, now I would like to refer to different types of legal rules which may be used to establish more intense limits to the exercise of rights based on the existence of an economic emergency. In principle, the Congress is the branch of government which has the power to declare the situation of economic emergency. The Supreme Court initially accepted a stricter regulation of personal rights, especially property rights and the right to enter into contracts, while the Congress passed law regulating matters regarding the exercise of the police power. These laws were based on the current wording of Section 7518, the so-called Progress Clause, and Section 14 state that rights are applied consistent with the laws regulating their exercise. There are two other normative instruments to confront an economic emergency. Under Section 76 of the Constitution, the Congress also has the power to delegate any powers required to put an end to an economic emergency to the executive. And in the event there is an economic emergency and the requirements for necessity and urgency are met, the executive may use the power provided under Section 99(3) of the Constitution and issue a decree of necessity and urgency. As both normative devices have frequently been used before, even if they were not expressly included in the Constitution, the constitutional reform incorporated them with the purpose of limiting them. Legislative delegation was admitted in constitutional practice, even if it had not been expressly provided for, and its use was based on Section 99(2) of the Constitution. For these reasons, the 1994 constitutional amendment permitted the legislative delegation and subjected to multiple requirements. The Constitution states that, and I quote, legislative delegation to the executive is forbidden, except for certain matters in connection with administration or public emergency, with a fixed term for its exercise, and within the basis for the delegation established by the Congress. What we see here is that the Constitution establishes a general principle forbidding delegation to the executive, and subsequently determines the exceptions that may be accepted. The term public emergency is an indeterminate legal concept and may cover multiple types of emergencies, but others have criticized the fact that the meaning of public emergency is not clear, as if resorting to public emergency is no limit to the Argentine institutional reality. But it cannot be said that the guidelines in the Constitution have been useful to limit the way in which the legislative delegation has been used. Law number 25,561 was enacted to deal with the 2001 crisis, and the provisions of Section 76 of the Constitution declared the public emergency on social, economic, financial, and currency exchange grounds, and delegated to the executive various powers for 2 years. However, such rule has been extended 9 times and was valid until December 2017. It is a problem that the rule has been enforced during an extremely long period, but authors have also highlighted that the delegated powers were dangerously close to being prohibited under Section 29, which states Congress cannot give all public power to the executive. More recently, Law number 27,540, enacted on December 2019, declared the public emergency, very broad, on economic, financial, fiscal, administrative, social security, tariff, energy, health, and social grounds, and delegated to the executive various powers for 1 year. Another mechanism used to handle an economic emergency is the decree of necessity and urgency. The executive has used this tool even before the constitutional reform. For example, in the 1990 in Peralta case, the Supreme Court held that the decree was constitutional because of the serious social risk and generalized economic turmoil, that there was an urgent need, and Congress had not legislated otherwise. Section 99(3) provides for a general prohibition against their use. The executive power shall in no event issue provisions of legislative nature, and it allows issuing a decree based on necessity and urgency only when, due to exceptional circumstances, the ordinary procedures established under this Constitution for the enactment of the law are impossible to be followed, and when rules do not involve criminal issues, taxation, electoral matters, or the system of political parties. The Constitution also set forth a procedure for the ratifications of those decrees by Congress. In such procedure, the permanent bicameral committee must be involved, and the matter must then be dealt with by each of the houses of Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate. However, authors have seriously criticized this rule, saying that the way in which the Argentine Constitution regulates emergency decrees is probably one of the worst in Latin America, because nothing in the Constitution deters the president from using emergency powers in an unjustified way if he has the required majorities in one of the houses of Congress. Now, to face the COVID-19 pandemic, it was discussed whether the president should have declared the state of siege. I think that a state of siege, it was not the proper state of exceptions to be declared, because it has to exist an event of domestic disorder, but which endangers the full enforcement of the Constitution and of the authorities established by the fundamental text. I think the last requirements were not met. Besides, according to the constitutional text, the power of the president is limited with respect to persons to their arrest or transfer from one place of the nation to another. The president has issued many decrees of necessity and urgency. In 2020, they were 76. On March, through the Decree 297, the president established a preventive and compulsory social isolation, which remained for 8 months in a large part of the country. These measures taken restricted almost all constitutional rights. For instance, freedom of movement, right to work, right of assembly, right to teach and learn, religious freedoms, among others. At the same time, in the decree number 260, the president extended the public emergency on health grounds declared by Congress on the delegation law enacted on December 2019, I already mentioned. I consider this unconstitutional, considering that the Congress is the branch of government which declared the extension of the public emergency and decided to delegate certain powers to the executive. On the other hand, it can be said that economic emergency in Argentina, far from being an exceptional situation, is normal and standard. Scholars agree that Argentina suffers from a permanent emergency and have proposed putting an end to it, as the effects of such emergency are devastating. The importance of the danger entailed in endemic situations lies in that economic emergency regulations, like any other exceptional concept, has two key elements. On the one hand, they allow the restriction of individual rights, especially economic liberties. And on the other hand, they increase the powers of one of the branches of government, namely the executive. It has been underlined that the economic emergency alters institutional roles. And I quote, "This is made for the executive, as it is the only body that makes it on time. The legislature affirms the measure, sometimes the judiciary amends its effects." End of quote. While Argentina's Supreme Court rulings have admitted the restriction of rights with economic content based on the doctrine of economic emergency, the truth is that it has established certain requirements for validating rules entailing any such restrictions. The different requirements ensuring that using the power of emergency is lawful were systematically discussed by the Supreme Court in 1934 in the Abico case, which drew on the US precedent of Home Building and Loan Association versus Pleiston. These requirements are: 1, that there be an emergency requiring the exercise of exceptional powers to protect the key interests of society. 2, that the law be aimed at satisfying a legitimate interest and not to benefit a particular group of individuals. 3, that the remedy applied be proportionate and justified in light of the emergency. 4, that determine that the law be reasonable and does not harm any of the parties. And 5, that the law be valid for a provisional period limited to the emergency which caused it. While these guidelines plainly outline the contour of the constitutionality of an emergency measure, the courts have admitted the validity of many regulations which did not comply with the requirements mentioned at all. Indeed, the continued application of economic emergency rules would not have been possible without the deference of the courts. Throughout decades, the Argentine Supreme Court has tolerated the economic emergency-based measures adopted by the branches of government, admitting in some cases clear violations of rights protected under the Constitution, even if the requirements for the declarations of the emergency were not met. To sum up and to conclude, for almost a century, Argentina has been under permanent states of exception. Not only the state of siege, but also extraordinary rules to deal with economic emergencies. To face these emergency situations, different types of rules have been issued. While in principle the declaration of the existence of an economic emergency is the province of the Congress, the truth is that throughout decades, the executive has been taking on an increasingly prevalent role by issuing delegated decrees or decrees of necessity and urgency. The Argentine Supreme Court has established certain requirements for economic emergency rules to be valid. However, the branches of government have abused these rules. At the same time, courts have been extremely deferential to the decision of the Congress or the President. It is necessary to end the endless emergency, which affects institutions and creates great restrictions on fundamental rights. It is imperative to abandon the permanent presidential discretion and strengthen the role of Congress. To this end, it is important to have an appropriate judicial review in order to ensure proper use of states of exception. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. And I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards. And your perfect timing. I'm very impressed. So our second speaker is Marta Kleiman, and I will just hand things over to you, Marta.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. I'll just share my screen with you. Okay, I hope that everyone can see that. For some reason I don't see you now. Okay. So first of all, thank you all for joining us. I understand that for some of you, it is pretty late at night, so I really appreciate your effort. And thank you for the opportunity to discuss my dissertation proposal, probably raising more questions than answers. I would like to propose a slightly different interpretation of the emergency provisions Juan was discussing. I would like to suggest that Argentine decrees of urgency and necessity are not necessarily constitutional emergency. Nevertheless, I do not dismiss the option that these decrees pose a similar threat to democracy. So I will start with a theoretical explanation about the differences between constitutional emergency laws and ordinary laws. And I will then move to a more empirical explanation with the example of Argentina. And I will then conclude with a short review why this distinction actually matters. So very broadly, the dominant literature on emergency often distinguishes between constitutional emergency and other ordinary legislation. Basically, constitutional emergency are extraordinary measures for extraordinary circumstances that justify the suspension of democratic guarantees. On the other hand, there are regular legislations that are practiced within a functioning democratic system, even when addressing some challenges and limit some democratic guarantees. These limits are not exceptional, and their justification is not an imminent and temporary necessity, but rather the normal functioning of a democratic society. So I will go a little bit more into depth with that. I will start by clarifying that the category of constitutional emergency is not restricted only to cases where emergency powers are explicitly mentioned in the Constitution, like in the case of Argentina. Constitutional emergency can also refer to statutory emergency legislation that, when implemented, has constitutional consequences. And for example, this is the case in Canada. And also, I would like to suggest that some authors are also talking about statutory emergency legislations that are based on the constitutional principle of emergency and necessity. And then they often refer to the case of the US. So in other words, a constitutional emergency is not restricted to explicit provisions within the Constitution. It is a broader category that can include statutory legislations as well. And this brings me to my next point, which is, what do all of these constitutional emergencies share? So the literature often mentions 4 key characteristics that all constitutional emergencies have, at least to some extent. The first thing is that constitutional emergencies refer to extraordinary circumstances, like Juan was talking about. It's times of serious crisis or threat, like war or insurrection. Such circumstances are often contrasted with normal times. Normal times have their own challenges, of course, like crime, but these challenges do not amount to a serious threat. The next point is that constitutional emergencies require an official declaration that identifies the threat and establishes a state of emergency. The third point would be that during exceptional circumstances, there is a need for exceptional measures, and these are emergency powers. Democratic systems are assumed to be well equipped to deal with regular challenges during ordinary times, but exceptional threats require prompt and decisive responses that cannot be achieved within limited democratic systems. So constitutional emergency allows the suspension of key democratic features in order to allow the government to take a prompt and decisive action to deal with the exceptional circumstances. These emergency powers are often divided into two things. So the first thing is assumes that a democratic system is built on separation of power and a set of procedures for decision-making. And this institutional structure is very slow and it is inadequate in times of emergency. So constitutional emergencies overcome this inconvenience by concentrating the power usually within the executive. In other words, during an emergency, the executive has the emergency powers to make and implement decisions. The second thing is constitutionally guaranteed human rights are another limitation on government power. So during an emergency, these limitations can also prevent the government from addressing an imminent threat. So part of the emergency powers would be the authority to suspend human rights, and Juan was talking about it quite a lot. So I move to the fourth point, which is temporality. Constitutional emergencies are limited in time. Emergency powers are expensive and they would not be acceptable in normal times. In fact, emergency powers are bound by the exceptional circumstances. So as soon as the threat is over, the exceptional measures should be terminated as well. So just to conclude that, the dominant literature on emergency is based on the assumption that constitutional emergency provides governments with a lot of power in order to respond to a serious threat. Emergency powers are unacceptable during normal times, but they can be justified in exceptional circumstances. And while emergency powers suspend key democratic guarantees in the short run, this is justified in order to ensure the long-term survival of democracy. On the other hand, we have ordinary laws. So ordinary legislation, it's a much broader category, and it basically includes all of those laws that are not constitutional emergency because they're designed to function in normal circumstances. They do not require certain declaration about a threat. They're not supposed to provide the government with exceptional powers, and they're not necessarily temporary. And by that, I also mean that these ordinary legislation can be both constitutional provisions, for example, those provisions that describe an electoral system in the Constitution, or they can be statutory laws like criminal codes. In other words, the distinction that I will focus on here between these two types of legislation is their impact on democracy. While constitutional emergency is allowed to suspend democratic guarantees, ordinary laws remain within a functioning democratic system. So now the question is how these legislations are practiced. And to talk about it, I will focus on Argentina, specifically Article 23 and 99.3, the ones Juan mentioned as well. And I would say that the way they're practiced kind of challenges this theoretical distinction. So we can start with Article 23, the state of siege. I'll repeat a bit what Juan was saying. So Article 23 of the Argentine Constitution completes all four characteristics of the constitutional emergency as I mentioned them. It is limited to times of internal disorder or foreign attack that endangers the exercise of Argentine Constitution and of the authorities created thereby. It requires a formal declaration by the President or the Senate. It provides the President with almost unrestricted powers during a state of siege, and it allows the suspension of the constitutional guarantees. And although there is no explicit time limitation for a state of siege, these limits are implicit in the limited circumstances under which Article 23 can be invoked, and they were confirmed by the Supreme Court in several decisions. So just to bring an example, in November 1974, President Isabella Martinez de Perón declared the state of siege because of political instability. This declaration was followed in March 1976 by a military coup using the established state of siege and justifying their actions by the need to fight the subversives. The state of siege allowed the military basically to suspend all democratic guarantees. This last military regime in Argentina raises many debates and criticisms about the initial need to declare state of siege, its duration, and the measures implemented by the military regime, as well as questions about accountability and redress. And all of these questions are pretty common in the literature on emergency. But the thing is that Article 23 is a constitutional emergency, and when it is analyzed and criticized, the initial assumption is that it is still an exceptional tool to use. So it is expected to suspend democratic guarantees. And the debates are more concerned with how Article 23 was abused when managing this perceived threat, rather than whether it is a constitutional emergency in the first place. On the other hand, we have Article 99.3, which is, I would say, more debatable. So Juan mentioned that Article 99.3 can be viewed as another type of constitutional emergency in Argentina. It includes some of the constitutional emergency characteristics that I mentioned before, but not all. And more importantly, the manner in which this presidential authority was practiced in the last few decades raises questions about its emergency nature. According to Article 99.3, the presidential authority to issue decrees of urgency and necessity is restricted to when exceptional circumstances make it impossible to follow the regular procedures provided by the Argentine Constitution for the passing of laws. So Article 99.3 acknowledges a certain distinction between normal and exceptional circumstances. But the article doesn't require any official declaration of exceptional circumstances, which can undermine the initial justification for the use of the authority. It also, well, while it provides the president with legislative authority, there is still a requirement for the legislature's review and approval. So it was established in a 2006 law, the procedure how the legislature would approve these decrees. So according to the article, the powers of the president remain limited. And the last thing is that Article 99.3 says nothing about the temporary nature of such decrees. In fact, according to the 2006 law, these decrees can become permanent legislation unless both chambers reject them. So this kind of challenges the emergency nature of Article 99.3, but I would say it's not enough, because we can raise similar challenges to other laws around the world whose emergency nature is basically undebatable. So for example, we have the German constitutional emergency as introduced in 1968, which also provides the legislature with significant power to declare emergency and approve the emergency powers to be used. And in South Africa, the constitutional emergency did not set clear limits on time, and basically allowing the apartheid government to maintain a state of emergency for almost 3 decades. And this means that not all constitutional emergencies are necessarily limited in time or concentrate power within the executive. And these kind of challenges might suggest that Article 99.3 is still an emergency. But then, if we consider the way Article 99.3 was practiced, we can further challenge its constitutional nature. So first of all, we can see that the presidents of Argentina use this authority in circumstances that seem to be far from urgent or necessary. For example, decrees that established March 24 as a national holiday, or established pregnancy allowances. And if we look at statistical studies, we see a significant increase in presidential use of this authority, and the great majority of these decrees resulted in permanent legislation. So I think that this data further challenges the extraordinary nature of these decrees. In other words, the manner and frequency in which Article 99.3 was used by Argentine presidents raises questions about the basic assumption that there is a certain urgency and that there is a necessity for extraordinary measures. More than that, these decrees are rarely limited in time to a certain urgency. Like on the contrary, it suggests that this authority became an ordinary tool to pass permanent legislation. And this, I think, challenges the assumption that Article 1993 is another constitutional emergency law. So if we look back to this dominant theory about emergency, Article 1993 is not a constitutional emergency, primarily because it is not reserved for extraordinary circumstances, and it cannot justify extraordinary measures. We can say that even though the article was originally intended by the constitutional drafters to be an emergency legislation, it developed to be an ordinary legislative tool, often used by presidents for convenience rather than necessity. And in other words, as an ordinary tool, as an ordinary law, it should not suspend democratic guarantees and should function within a democratic system. But here where things become a bit more complicated, and that's where I come back to what Juan was saying, that some of these decrees still might be a matter of necessity and urgency. Like Juan presented the Argentine economic crisis. Another example would be a series of decrees regarding organized crime, terrorism, and narco-trafficking. In both cases, the presidents claimed that there is an emergency to justify pretty controversial legislation. So, and one more point about that is that actually the anti-crime decrees suspended some key constitutional guarantees, like the right for fair trial. So now the question is Article 93 a constitutional emergency or not? And what is the impact of Article 1993 on Argentine democracy? Does it suspend democracy as Article 23 does or not? And why does it matter? Why does it matter? So here are just some thoughts based on this theoretical distinction. If we decide that Article 1993 is a constitutional emergency, that it can suspend democratic guarantees, we should be concerned about the continuous use of this power. If 1993 is a constitutional emergency, then we can assume that the understanding of exceptional circumstances under which it can be used became very broad, often including circumstances that were considered normal in the past. And this is not restricted to Argentina. There are authors who found such practices in many other countries where exceptionalism basically became the new normalcy. According to this explanation, circumstances that justify the suspension of democratic guarantees are no longer the exception, but rather the norm. But then if we think that Article 1993 is an ordinary law, not as an emergency, things might become a bit more complicated. It will mean that Article 1993 should be used as part of a functioning democratic system, and that it cannot suspend democratic guarantees, at least not officially. But as the example of the counter-crime decrees shows, for Article 1993 sometimes results in severe suspension of democratic guarantees. So certain legislations might seem to be ordinary, but some of their consequences can be as threatening to democracy as constitutional emergency. But these legislations might also be less visible and raise less concern because of their assumptions they still function within a democratic structure. So now I would move a little bit away from these theoretical distinction, just to conclude that the distinction between the constitutional emergency and ordinary laws is problematic. Not all laws easily fall within one of these categories, but this distinction might still be useful because it can highlight this complexity. This distinction assumes that each of the categories has a different relationship to democracy. So depending on how we classify different types of legislation, especially the more ambiguous one, we can reach a more detailed explanation of how they impact democracy. And I know that I'm leaving you with a lot of questions, but I would finish here. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Marta. That was interesting. Give us a different angle on what Juan presented. I'm sure that was going to bring up lots of questions for the discussion afterwards. Our final presenter is Alejandro Matia, and I will let you get started, Alejandro.
Hi, can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Great. Where I'm delighted to be with you, and thanks for the invitation. I'm actually a philosopher, so I'm not a political scientist or a lawyer. So I'm gonna share with you some talks about the question of the seminar about the state and the emergency. So I want to talk about the states in emergency and the states of emergency. Maybe we have a useful distinction about that, not the states in emergency and the states of emergency. And I will defend three theses. And the first one, I think that in our current situation, emergencies are no longer emergent. And I think that, especially thinking about the last part of Marta's presentation, I think that a very important discussion in this moment is the difficult of separate the normal and exceptional in this moment in our history. So in our current situation, emergencies are no longer emergent. The second thesis that I want to defend is that the neoliberal configuration of the states in Latin America makes the public response to emergencies increasingly weak and even insufficient for a lot of troubles. I mean, we have in our countries since the 19th from now, excuse me, very challenge changes in our states. So for that reason, I think that the neoliberal turn in our countries makes the public response to emergencies increasingly weak and even insufficient, especially thinking in the social rights of our population. And so we have a problem about the functions of the states. And the third one, the third thesis, I think that, however, the states exhibit new powers to manage emergencies, in thinking especially in the concept of a state of emergency. I mean, I want to make a distinction between the powers of the state and the functions of the state. So I think that in the second thesis, we have a problem about the functions of the state, but at the same time, we have a worry about the new powers to manage emergencies in this historical moment. So I'm gonna show you and explain this kind of thesis. At the first one, I wanna begin talking about a very interesting Polish writer. His name was Stanisław Yersilek. Stanisław Yersilek, a Polish writer. Once he wrote the next phrase: what is chaos? The chaos is the order destroyed after the creation of the world. What is chaos? The chaos is the order destroyed after the creation of the world. I mean, the line between the normal and the exceptional sometimes is very thin. And for that reason, in this moment, I think that in the current century, a lot of global scientists claim about the reality of the multiple crises and the crisis of the civilization as a whole. I mean, we are in a global situation in which multiple crises converge. For example, the financial crisis, the environmental crisis, the climate change, the energy crisis, even the food crisis. So in that scenario, sometimes that kind of crisis strengthen each other. For example, the environmental crisis could make worse the food crisis, because the climate change generates a crisis in the food production. So thinking about that situation, thinking about the multiple crises or the crisis of the civilization as a whole, we think that, or we found that in this moment, a lot of strange situations could emerge in our societies, in our countries. For example, the climate change brings us a new era of worse hurricanes, tsunamis, or even floods. So in this moment, we are developing a kind of feeling of insecurity, and we live in a feeling of permanent incertitude. I mean, in this moment, we have a crisis of hope. We, in this moment, have the permanent risk about our health, about our security, about our financial situation, about our job. So this kind of multiple crises, this kind of a crisis of civilization bring us a very strange situation when we have absolute insecurity about our future and about even our present. So we live in a feeling of permanent incertitude. And it's so interesting, this situation, because that was our global situation before the pandemic. I mean, the pandemic has been a catalyst of the global crisis. We were in a global crisis. We were in a very terrible situation about climate change, for example. And the pandemic has been a catalyst of that kind of global crisis. So a few years ago, we were in a situation of doubt about the future. Now we are in a crisis of hope, because we feel insecurity about the future and even about the present. We don't know what could happen the next week. And that situation brings a lot of unexpected processes. For example, the mass migrations in the whole region. Think about the situation of mass migrations from Venezuela or from Honduras. That kind of situation changed the whole region, changed the labor market, changed the situation of health even. So the mass migration is just a symptom of the whole insecurity that we are living in this moment, because the people has to be to move to another country because has no feeling of security. The people has to looking for new jobs beyond their borders, beyond their own countries, and that is a symptom of how that kind of migrations is a symptom of how the people has to live in a very hard situation. So at the same time, politically speaking, we are in a moment of global instability, especially in the region, because we could think about the situation of Peru, Guatemala, Brazil, Colombia, or even the United States. We have situations of violence, the weakness of the political systems, and new kinds of authoritarianism. Even authoritarianism, not only from the government, but also from below, from the people itself, and that is very, very dangerous. So for that reasons, I claim that emergencies are no longer emergent. Our normality is a situation of emergency for the whole reasons that I was talking about. That is the first thesis. So in the second thesis, I want to talk about how the neoliberal turn in our countries has a neoliberal configuration in the states that makes the public response to that kind of emergencies increasingly weak and even insufficient. And I'm going to make a distinction between powers and functions of the state. When I'm talking about state functions, I think about how the actions of the state is how the action of the state has a relation with the design of the state. I mean, the welfare state, for example, is a state that his actions try to make security for the people, especially with the social rights. But in a neoliberal state, that kind of functions try to be weak and try to be insufficient for the needs of the people. So the state functions has two relations with the actions about the design of the state. But the powers of the state has to be in relation with how that kind of actions of the states are authorized to take, especially in relation to individual rights. I mean, the functions of the state are those actions for which the states were designed, but the powers of the state are that or those actions that states are authorized to take, especially in relation to individual rights. There's a whole distinction between the actions that the state could make in relation with the design of the state and the actions of the state about the authority of the state. So the neoliberal turn made the social functions of the state weaker, but did not weaken the powers of the state. And for me, that's the core. Is the core of the problem. I mean, we have states that are very powerful about the states of emergency, but the states very weak about social problems. So let's think about the current vaccination process. Right now, who has the bargaining power? They are not the states. The bargaining power right now are the private pharmaceutical companies. So we have unpowerful states about public health or provision of food or some social services, but at the same time, we have powerful states in matters of public order. So finally, the last thesis, I claim the states exhibit new powers to manage emergencies, but not in the sense, about the states in emergency, but in the sense of the states of emergency. For example, let's think about the lockdown decisions in the whole world. The lockdown decisions were necessary as a public health policy, but have created a very dangerous precedent about individual rights. It is very dangerous for every society to use force to protect health. It is very dangerous to focus on the authority based upon the force to protect the health of the people, because our states, I'm going to insist, are very powerful about the public order, but not about the social functions, the social rights. So right now, in our region, we have corporate political regimes, and in some cases, mafia practices within the state. So when I think about the states of emergency, I also think in the states of emergency de facto. For example, the situation of the drug dealing in countries as Mexico, Brazil, or Colombia. In Sao Paulo, in Medellin, and I don't know, some places in Mexico, we have a state of emergency, a state of exception regime de facto, but not from the state, but from the crime. So in our countries, for example, in Colombia, the lockdown in some places was not regulated for the state, was regulated for the paramilitary groups. So we have powerful states, but at the same time, we have powerful drug cartels or mafia groups that could make, in practice, states of emergency or states of exception. And at the same time, we have corporate political regimes where the private companies has the power to control a lot of the economy and a lot of public services. So sometimes not only the only authority in some regions are the private armies. That kind of private armies belongs to drug cartels, but also belongs to private companies. Let's think about the oil extractions companies. Let's think about the mining projects. That kind of projects has relations with private armies. So we are in our reality, in our political systems, a lot of privatizations, even of the army, even of the public force. So, for example, in our country, we have agreements between private companies with the armed forces. I mean, companies of mining that are protected by the army or by the marine. So in that situation, the public forces tries not to protect the whole people, but to protect the private investment. So we have right now a state of emergency from the state, a state of exception state, but at the same time we have a state that are privatized even in the core of the state that has the right to establish the force or the monopoly of the force, as Max Weber said. So in our time, in our moment, we have a risk of permanent states of exception and permanent states of emergency in an era marked by crisis that could bring threats to our rights and our freedom. But at the same time, we have the weakness of the public sphere in general. The weakness of the public sphere in general, because the neoliberal turn brings us privatization of a lot of public functions of the state. So for conclude, I think that we have a very dangerous situation, not only in our countries, but in the whole world. We have a situation of global crisis, not only financial crisis. We have a health crisis, we have an environmental crisis, we have a food crisis, we have an energy crisis. And at the same time, we have states with no function about themes related with health or food or the home for the people, and more powerful states that put in danger our individual rights, and in the practice, very big companies, some legal and some illegal, as the cartel of drugs. So we live in a very difficult situation, and that is the challenge for the political science, both for the political movements and the social movements in the region, because our main challenge is how to restore the public sphere in the way to protect democracy and to provide social rights for the whole population. Thanks, that's all. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much to Alejandro and to all the speakers. We now have about 25 minutes for question and answers. So if you want to indicate in the chat if you have a question, and then I'll call on you in the order that the questions appear in the chat. Carlos, I see your hand. Oh, yeah, Carlos, please, Carlos Gamba.
Yeah, no, I only want to put this question in this context. I'm going to mention 3 controversial decisions by presidents in US and Twitter. Twitter could be the account, you know the issue, and on the other hand, President of the US ordered to kill a general in Iran. Mr. Obama ordered to kill Osama bin Laden. So how do you put this kind of incidents in the context of your presentations? Thank you very much.
Go ahead, who would like to answer?
Marta, would you like to answer?
I actually wanted to ask for a clarification for the question, but if you have something to say, go for it.
No, ask please.
So Carlos, just to clarify, I understood the question about bin Laden, but I think I missed a bit the question regarding Twitter at the beginning. So could you please repeat it or clarify?
Let me clarify. Two decisions by presidents of U.S. Extraterritorial in cases, and the other is a decision of a kind of quasi-state, Twitter. So one is a decision from a former state like U.S. Their presidents, two different presidents, took decisions, and the other is a decision of a kind of quasi-state, Twitter, because if Twitter continues doing that, of course, it's a very, very controversial that could the liberty of expression of anyone, including the president of US. This is the idea to put in the context of this conversation. Thank you.
Unfortunately, I'm not really familiar with the order to kill bin Laden. I don't really know on what it was based and how it was reached. So sorry, but I cannot really contribute there. Regarding Twitter, I think this is a fascinating question, especially because Alejandro was kind of talking about how non-state actors suddenly have the power that usually states had. And honestly, I didn't have a chance to think about it, but it's definitely a very interesting question. So maybe Juan or Alejandro have something to say about that.
No, just said regarding the killing of Osama bin Laden or this kind of measures adopted by the United States. I think that I am not a specialist of the U.S. Power. I think it's within the exercise of power within the war, but we would have to look just the legal basis of those actions adopted by the United States. But I can't answer because I'm not a specialist of that issue. And it's interesting, Carlos, what you said about Twitter. I think it's really interesting, but I don't know if in this topic of emergency powers, but I think it's really interesting regarding the right to speech, and if a private company can shut down the Twitter of the president, the now former president of the United States. I think it's a really interesting question, but I think that I don't have a proper answer to you right now. I'm sorry.
Well, thanks, Carlos. I think that is a problem that the public sphere has been captured by private companies. And that's the problem with social media. It's a very interesting space for the debate and for express our views about the world. But that kind of space has been captured for private companies. So the private companies could regulate in these own views, and especially thinking about money and not thinking about the democracy of the opinions or rational deliberation. So for me, is that the problem? But at the same time, I think that we have to stop every expression of hate speech. And that's a very difficult situation because we have the responsibility to stop the hate speech. But at the same time, I have the question, who has to stop that kind of hate speech? The private companies or the rational deliberation? So I think that is a very controversial issue, and I think that is a very difficult issue. But I think that is a problem that the public sphere has been captured for the private companies. And we have to think how to restore the public sphere. Even the public sphere in the deliberational issues, in the dialogue for the democracy, in the exchange of views of the world. But I think that is a very controversial issue, but I just want to make visible that tension between how to stop the hate speech, but at the same time, who has to stop that kind of hate speech.
So thank you, Carlos, for your question. In the meantime, there's been a bunch of people asking questions, and so we've got 3 questions. In the interest of time, given we've only got about 20 more minutes, I'm going to ask people to present their questions. We've got 3, and then let the speakers respond to the 3 questions together. So the first question is from Lisa Gordon. If you want to ask the speakers yourself.
Sure, thank you. Yes, it's about the climate crisis, just as a lens on the range of emergency measures around the world and the increasing risk to democracy. I'm wondering if you can recommend any writers who bring a global perspective to that and the range of responses that we can expect in existing law or how laws might change.
Great, thank you. And then the second question is from Johan Pitter, if you'd like to ask your question.
Hello, yeah. First of all, I would like to thank you all for your time. And second of all, I was thinking more along the lines of the state of emergency. That's something that Walter Benjamin as well as Agamben have talked about, at least from my perspective, right? Could we say though that right now, I guess Article 99.3, as well as the different choices that have been made in the United States and some in Eastern Europe, that these reinforcing of the power over social order that Alejandro talked about are in a way also being internalized by citizens? And also, what is the role of the media, keeping in mind as well of what you said, that they are private, that this is not just like a public sphere in which you talk, but rather a private sphere? Thank you.
Thank you. And we have a question also from Claire Wright. If Claire, if you'd like to ask your question. Oh, okay. She can't speak because it's very, very late. So I will read out her question. I believe Claire's coming to us from Ireland, so it is very late at night. I'm glad you're able to join us, Claire. So her question here is, well, she states, congratulations on this excellent panel. I wanted to ask, what has the COVID crisis taught us about emergency powers in Latin America? The pandemic offers us an opportunity to see how different states are responding to the same threat and may offer insight on different cultures of emergency. If you could share your thoughts, that would be really interesting. Thanks. So I'll turn things over to the speakers, and if you'd like to respond to those questions.
Okay, thank you for the questions to you all. I think that I'm going to answer, I think that I'm able to answer the third one. How was the response to the COVID-19 pandemic in Argentina? In the first place, I just to say that when the pandemic arrived to Argentina, the Congress was closed, and remained closed for 2 months. And so the executive is the branch of government who adopted some measures. At first, we had a problem because, as I said in the dissertation, there was a delegation law that delegated many powers to the executive, and there was a delegation about the health issue. And the problem was whether the president could use that law, that delegate law, or he can issue this decrees of necessity and urgency. What the executive did is issue this decrees of necessity and urgency, and also, as I said, it extended this public emergency declared by Congress by a decree of necessity and urgency. And this it was a problem because I think that's unconstitutional. But all the measures adopted to face the pandemic, just the isolation for the society that remained for 8 months, and then it took different measures regarding the economic emergency, as states of evictions, establishing maximum prices for first necessities. It was all the executive who actually take those measures. Then the Congress started to session and enacted some laws, but what we can see here is that the executive had made had adopted a lot of measures, and I don't know, that's maybe a problem, because the executive, when issue a decree of necessity and urgency, there's no publicity, there's no discussion as there is when a law is passed by Congress. So that's why I think that Congress may adopt, or I think that have a more important role to cope with the pandemic.
Thank you. Marta or Alejandro?
I can say something about the question on the climate crisis. So unfortunately, I'm not familiar really with literature that is actually addressing climate crisis, but there is a lot of literature that is addressing natural disasters. And it is very interesting to see how differently authors usually come when they analyze the different emergency measures taken to address, I don't know, more violent crises like terrorism and wars and things like that, and then how they address the measures that are used when there is an environmental disaster. And if you're interested, I have an interesting article about what the US did. So if you can just email me, I would be happy to share it with you. And then regarding what Johan was saying, I hope that I understood your question correctly. So you were talking about how emergency is basically internalized by citizens. So if I understand what you mean is that people just get used to these circumstances, that just get used to emergencies. And I think this is one of the big problems, because emergencies became so common that people no longer, and like it just becomes their normality. And I can give you, for example, Israel, that is basically in a state of emergency since 1948. And when you walk on the street, no one actually knows that they are under a state of emergency. And that's like, obviously this is a problem, because people don't understand that some of the things that happen are not supposed to happen in a democracy, but they are so used to it, so they don't even pay attention to what's happening. Yeah, that's what I have for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Alejandro?
Thanks for your questions. I just want to say a little thing about the question of Elisa about the opportunities in this current situation. I think that the pandemic in Latin America showed us our own vulnerability as a region and as a different societies. I mean, the pandemic showed us the big problem about gender violence, for example. The pandemic showed us the vulnerability about our public health systems. In some societies, for example, Colombia, we have a privatized social system of health, and that shows us our vulnerability caused by the politics of privatization in the neoliberal turn. And at the same time, the pandemics show us our vulnerability in our economy. Our economy are in a very hard situation right now. But at the same time, in some regions in Latin America, we have a very wonderful expressions of social movements. The marvelous, of course, movement of the green scarf in Argentina, for example, the mobilizations against corruption in Peru, the mobilizations in Brazil against Bolsonaro, and that kind of social movements is a very interesting example of democracy, even in a very hard time. So for me, the hope in this moment of crisis belongs to the social movements. And I think that in the time of crisis, sometimes a few people could make a difference. And especially thinking in the green scarf in Argentina or the mobilizations against corruption in Peru, make me a little bit optimistic about the future.
Thank you. So we still have a little bit of time. I don't see any other questions, but please raise your hand if you do have questions. I also thought it'd be interesting if the panelists, if you had any questions for each other, especially Marta and Juan have some different perspectives on Argentine emergencies. So perhaps you have some questions you'd like to pose to each other.
Thank you, Michelle. Yes, when Marta was talking, I was taking some notes. We discussed this with Marta last week, so I was not surprised when I hear her dissertation. But I think that what we have to think here is what we do when the emergency rules are applied all the time. And this is a problem, but because I think that the 1993 of the Argentine Constitution was intended to limit the executive discretion, and there was a discussion whether it was necessary to include in the constitutional amendment the delegation doctrine and the decrees of necessity and urgency. And well, at the end they include this institute, but with the idea to limiting them. And the constitution, I think that it's very clear when it says that the executive power shall not issue a legislative measure, but it admitted with some limitations that I already talked about. So I think that, for example, 1993, it's a dire necessity. It's really for example, if Congress cannot enact law in the time, is a huge necessity, and there has to be a real urgency in the matter. I think that in 1993 can be exercised at the same time with the ordinary provisions. I think that maybe there is an economic emergency within the sector, and maybe it could be issue a decree of necessity and urgency. But okay, but maybe it can live with another ordinary provisions, not like the state of siege that maybe it's a state of exceptions that come to change all the normality. Well, I think that also that the declaration of the emergency in the case of the decree of necessity and urgency is the executive of the president of the nations who declared the emergency. He has to justify the emergency circumstances, and then he adopts some measures. Then the Congress, who is the branch of government, who in principle had to take that measure, but he couldn't because of the procedures of the legislature. Okay, the Congress is going to review that measure adopted. But I don't want to talk a lot, so Marta, you can reply, answer to me that.
Yeah, I completely agree with you that I think that's the point, that 1993 is kind of like weird. it was meant to be more of an emergency, right? As you said, it was restricted by the constitutional drafters to be implemented only in cases of real necessity and urgency. But then the way it developed, it's very, I would say that it's very hard to actually regard it as emergency. I would say that if it was still used each time for like economic emergency, criminal emergency, or pandemics, things like that, then yes, maybe its emergency nature wouldn't be as debatable, because there's all of these circumstances might be considered as emergency. But then, as I mentioned, there are quite a few examples where 1993 was used just to pass regular legislation, and the emergency or the urgency there is just absent. And then the other thing is that, yeah, like the president doesn't have a legislative power, but ultimately most of his decrees became permanent laws, either because the Congress actually accepted them, but that I think was like only 13% of all decrees in the last decade, while 70 and something percent was just accepted because the Congress didn't take any action. So I'm not going to why the Congress didn't take any action, because there are like a lot of explanations there as well, but the ultimate, let's say, fact is that most of these decrees became actually permanent legislation. So I think this raises important questions about different laws that seem to be emergency or regular, but acts like the other way around. So it just raises the question of what these laws are, how we should treat them, what they can do and cannot do, and how they impact democracy on the ground. So I'm most interested in the last question, like what actually they do to democracy when they are used. So I completely agree with you that it's complicated. It might have began as emergency, but it developed in a way that I really doubt it is an emergency, but it is used sometimes as an emergency. So it's just very confusing, and that's where I'm kind of now with the proposal, trying to figure these things out. I don't really have answers to that.
Right. Well, I think with only 2 minutes to go, unless Alejandro, do you have any final comments? No? Well, I want to thank you very much to our three speakers, Marta, Juan, Alejandro, for being here with us today, and for everybody in the audience who have joined us from many countries around the world. Thank you, especially those of you who have joined us quite late at night. And thank you to Beatriz Delva Koch for her help with the organization, Fabricio Tello for the organization, and the Center for Global Studies.